Hey guys, Rob here with a new tutorial. Today's subject, one-point perspective. I made this diagram over here to help illustrate exactly what's going on when we're using perspective. You can see a little guy in the middle there. He's the person viewing the scene we're going to draw. You can call him the camera, but cameras take longer to draw, so he's a little dude this time around. Now the little guy is standing right on the center of an X with dots on each end that say Vanishing Point. This is an illustration of the two axes which determine where lines that extend off into infinity will disappear into on the horizon. And that might sound kind of complicated, but it really isn't. Let's take this one step at a time. Today, we're focusing on Vanishing Point 1. You can see that I've drawn an arrow with an eye at the end to show the direction the camera is looking. This just happens to be parallel to the axis that ends in Vanishing Point A. In other words, he's looking straight at the vanishing point. The box labeled Image Viewed represents the image that we're going to capture in our drawing. So now we're just going to switch over to a different view, the view that the camera has. So here's pretty much what the camera would see. A horizon line and the red dot that represents Vanishing Point 1. I've set the vanishing point a little off center just to make it more visually appealing. Now from the vanishing point we can draw out our lines with a ruler extending right out to the edge of the page so we can have our perspective grid. There we go. But that's only half the grid. We need the other lines. Luckily, since this is only one-point perspective, drawing the other lines is easy. All the horizontal lines are going to be parallel to the horizon line. In other words, straight and horizontal. The reason they're horizontal is that the two vanishing points, point 2 and point 3, are directly to the left and right of the viewer and extend off into infinity. And that would calculate out to a ridiculously small angle. It's much easier just to draw them as straight horizontal lines. This will make a little more sense once I've covered two-point perspective in my next video, but for now, straight lines. And there we go. We have our grid. Now to use it. So I've switched over to Photoshop here so that I can work a little bit on the grid. And one thing that I'm going to suggest that you guys do, especially if it's you're pretty new to using perspective grids. First, hang on, I'm just going to lower the opacity here and work on a level on top. Is I think you should draw in the size that you're going to be using for the size of a character, just as a reference point. So I'm just going to kind of doodle in this little kind of shape here. This is going to be my size key. Everything else in the scene is going to be sized in relation to this. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. It's not quite as big as I wanted it. There we go. That'll do. So like I said, this is your size key. You're going to draw lines off to the vanishing point so that you can get an idea of how big a person's going to be further back in perspective. So if I just draw lines from the bottom of this character and the top of this character off into the distance, that's going to be kind of my floor grid, my furthest point. There we go. I'm going to draw those lines in. Then where that floor point is, I can determine exactly how tall a person is way off in the distance. See, they're pretty small. And now from that, I can kind of decide exactly how tall I want. I'm going to put a set of buildings back here. And I can decide accordingly, let's say about this big will be a kind of a short couple-story building. So I'm just going to speed up the rest of me drawing this scene so I can fit it all into a 10-minute video. You see, I'm using the lines here as reference points. Anything that's going vertical or horizontal, I can use the shift button to make perfectly straight. But anything that's kind of receding off in perspective, I'm using the grid lines. They don't have to be directly on the grid lines, but you use them as kind of references for where things should go. And right now, I'm just kind of going in and I'm blocking in the shapes of where some buildings are going to be. You can see how I'm using my perspective grid as a guide to help me with my perspective. There we go. And then, I've got kind of a generalized scene, and because of that size key in there, I can really decide how big things are going to be. Now, I want to put some steps in here. My first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use can see me using the perspective lines to draw my key over closer to where I want to put some stairs in so that I can make sure they're the right size. You know, if I had just drawn them straight off the bat without using the key, the size key, probably would have been too big. So this is one of those useful things about the perspective grid. And you can see I'm just kind of going in and putting some details in. A lot of this detail stuff is really going to come from using photo reference for buildings. You should always use photos as reference for when you're drawing, because unless you have an eidetic memory, you're not going to be able to remember all the little tiny details. Anyway, so I think you guys are getting the idea here of me using how to use the perspective grid to kind of determine where things are going to go. And then it really all comes down to lots of time and work to kind of finish it off, which I don't want to put into at this point because this is just an example of how to use a perspective grid. So that's not a bad little example for using the perspective grid. Looks okay. Obviously I could spend a lot more time working it, but I'm actually going to delete it now because I want to go over a little tip for when you're using one-point perspective. There's a tendency when you're doing one-point perspective that your the results that you're going to get are going to look a little flat. That's just because everything kind of lines up so perfectly and stuff, and you're going to have a little bit of trouble, most likely, showing depth in your drawing. So one thing I would suggest when you're doing one-point perspective specifically is when you're drawing things, overlap your shapes as much as possible. You can see with this, if I kind of overlap this front shape right over top of that midground one, immediately you're going to start getting a better sense of depth to the image that you're drawing, because you have things that are quite obviously in front of one another in space, and that will give your viewer, their eye, reference points so that their brain can see the depth in the image more clearly. And I mean, this kind of goes, you can keep going with this, adding more and more shapes overlapping. This is kind of a design thing when you're kind of coming up with concepts for your locations and for your your backgrounds in general. When you're first kind of coming up with them, is try to make sure you have some overlapping shapes from the views you're going to be using most often, because like I said, it's gonna help a lot with the appeal of the image, the final image that you're going to end up with. So like I said, I've got this overlapping stuff, just kind of adding to the overall depth of my drawing. And then another tip that I have as well is when you're doing this kind of thing with lines overlapping other lines, one thing you can do to make your objects stand out more than just by drawing them like this is wherever a line overlaps another line, if you darken the line that's in front of another one like this, right? You kind of thicken it and darken it just a little bit. What that will do is it will make it appear like it will stand out more. You'll get a better sense of the fact that that is a hard edge, and behind it, the object behind it is going to be further back in the distance. And then don't go overboard with it, because if you really start pushing that, it might backfire on you. But that's a little tip that you can use when you are drawing in one-point perspective. It works in two-point perspective as well. Overlapping shapes will have a sharper, harder line when they're standing in front of something else.